King Richard II's mysterious death. What really happened at Bosworth? August 22nd, 1485, the first light of dawn. A battle that would change England's fate was about to begin. But we had no idea that the truth emerging from this battle would remain hidden for 500 years. Two deep wound marks on a skull found in a Leicester parking lot in 2012 would reveal shocking truths about Richard II's death. But what was the story behind these wounds? How did the king really die? Today, I'll tell you the final moments of England's most controversial king, using findings from modern science and archaeology. But remember, this isn't just a death story, it's also a betrayal story that changed England's destiny. Was the hunchbacked monster Shakespeare told us about real? Did the princes really die? And most importantly, what really happened to Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth? Write your guesses in the comments. Who killed Richard III? Was it by sword, or another weapon? Let's solve this 500-year-old mystery together. The Bloody Rise, beginning of the mystery. April 9, 1483. King Edward IV of England died unexpectedly at just 40 years old. He left behind two young sons, 12-year-old Edward and 9-year-old Richard. But here's something you might never have wondered: why did a king die so young? The answer to this question might be the key to Richard II's story. Because some historians think Edward IV's death wasn't so natural after all. What if Richard had killed his brother? This is just a theory, but think about it. If he killed his brother, killing his nephews would be much easier. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was appointed as his nephew's protector. At 30, he was an experienced warrior and politician. But here's something that might surprise you: unlike Shakespeare's portrayal, Richard wasn't physically hunchbacked. Modern archaeological findings show he only had mild scoliosis. Write in the comments, what would you have done if you were in his position and the throne was so close? Is power really that corrupting? Richard knelt before young Edward at Westminster, swearing an oath of loyalty. "I will protect you, your majesty," he said. But what was going through his mind at that moment? Historical records tell us a terrifying truth. The first move was to place the princes in the Tower of London. But pay attention, this was normal practice at the time. The tower was both a fortress and a royal palace. So Richard wasn't guilty yet. The princes in the tower, the secret of disappearance. Within the thick walls of the Tower of London, two young princes were living their final normal days. According to contemporary witnesses, initially the princes seemed quite comfortable in the tower. They played in the garden, took their lessons, lived a normal court life. But then strange things began to happen. By late May, visits to the princes began to decrease. By June, they were no longer seen at the windows. Guess in the comments, was this change coincidental, or part of Richard's plan? So what was Richard doing at this time? He was trying to convince Parliament members at Westminster. His argument was this: Edward IV's marriage was invalid because he had previously married another woman. In that case, the children would be illegitimate and the throne would pass to Richard. On June 26, 1483, this law was officially enacted. Young Edward was no longer king. Richard would become England's new king. But where were the princes at this time? In late June, servants working in the tower noticed something shocking. The princes' rooms were empty. Their toys were still there, their beds were messy, as if they had been hastily abandoned. But the princes would never be seen again. What do you think? Were the princes kidnapped, or secretly murdered? Hit like if you think it's the second option. The birth of King Richard, power and betrayal. July 6, 1483, Westminster Abbey. Richard's coronation took place magnificently. But do you know what you would see on the crowd's faces? Suspicion and fear. Because everyone was asking the same question: where are the princes? Richard's official explanation was that they had been taken to a secret location for security reasons. But nobody believed this. It was at this point that Richard II's true character began to emerge. Rebellions broke out in southern England. Threats came from France. The people were crushed under heavy taxes. Write in the comments, why would a king oppress his people like this? Was it guilt, or paranoia? And right at this moment, a young nobleman living in exile took action, Henry Tudor. At 28, he had been in exile for 14 years. But he was the last representative of the Lancaster dynasty and had a claim to the throne. Henry's situation seemed hopeless. He only had a small army of 2,000 men. Richard had a powerful army of 8,000. So how would Henry win? The answer is simple: betrayal. Henry Tudor's gamble. In 1485, Henry Tudor was playing the biggest gamble of his life. He would attack England with the small support he received from France. But he had a secret: Richard's own men were preparing to betray him. Do you know Henry's clever move? He promised to marry Elizabeth of York. Who is this Elizabeth? Edward IV's daughter, the sister of the missing princes. This marriage would unite the York and Lancaster dynasties and end the Wars of the Roses. Write in the comments, was this marriage proposal a political move, or true love? When Henry landed in England, Richard was in panic. Because Henry's army was growing every day. People were joining him. Why? Because they hated Richard. But the real problem was with Richard's own commanders. Thomas Stanley was Henry Tudor's stepfather and one of Richard's most trusted generals. So which side would Stanley remain loyal to? Richard took Stanley's son hostage. If you betray me, your son dies, he said. But Stanley's answer was shocking: I have other sons too. It was at this point that Richard's fate was sealed. Because now he couldn't trust anyone. Towards Bosworth, the Death March. August 21st, 1485. Richard set out from Leicester with his army. But this march was actually a death march. Because his army had lost morale. Guess in the comments, could Richard sleep that night? How would you have felt if you were in his place? Richard's army had three important commanders: Thomas Stanley, Henry Percy, and Richard himself. But Stanley and Percy's loyalty was questionable. Richard was actually alone. Historical records tell us that Richard had nightmares that night. In his dreams, all the people he had killed came to him. The ghosts of the princes, his brother's spirit. Was this just guilt, or real remorse? On the morning of August 22nd, two armies faced each other on Bosworth Field. Richard's army of 8,000 was numerically superior to Henry's army of 5,000. But the Stanley brothers were waiting with an army of 6,000, deciding which side to take. The battle began at 9 a.m. In the first clash, Richard's army lost the advantage. His left wing had collapsed. But Richard hadn't given up yet. Richard's final desperate gambit. On the battlefield, Richard noticed something. He saw Henry Tudor. He was only a few hundred meters away and had very few guards. It was at this point that Richard did something no king in history had ever done. Taking all the royal cavalry, he launched a direct attack on Henry. Write in the comments, was this mad courage, or desperation? Richard's attack almost succeeded. He killed Sir William Brandon, Henry Tudor's standard bearer. He came within just a few meters of Henry. One more minute and history would have changed. But right at that moment, the betrayal happened. Sir William Stanley attacked Richard from behind with an army of 3,000. Richard was now surrounded. But here's an interesting detail: Richard's crown was still on his head. He could have removed it, hidden his identity, escaped. But he didn't. Why? Because Richard chose to live as a king, to die as a king. I'd rather die than remove my crown, he said. The mysterious death, the truth emerges. How exactly did Richard's final moments unfold? For 500 years, nobody could know for certain. But the skull found in Leicester in 2012 finally solved this mystery. Archaeological findings show that Richard's death was much more brutal. There are 2 large wound marks on the skull. First wound, at the back of the skull, a large sword blow. This blow alone was fatal. But the story doesn't end here. Second wound, at the base of the skull, probably struck with a halberd, long-handled axe. This blow was struck after Richard died. Write in the comments, why was this second blow struck? Was it anger, or display? Archaeologists found a total of 11 wounds on Richard's body. 8 of them were on his head. What does this mean? Richard's body wasn't harmed, only his head was attacked. Why? Because Richard was armored and his body was protected. But his helmet had fallen during battle. This left his head defenseless. The most shocking finding, some of Richard's wounds were post-mortem. That is, struck after death. This is a rare occurrence in medieval warfare. The crown changes hands, history's turning point. The crown removed from Richard's head was placed on Henry Tudor's head on the battlefield. Sir William Stanley shouted, "Long live King Henry." This moment wasn't just a change of king. This was the moment that changed England's fate. Because Henry VII founded the Tudor dynasty. And who were the children of this dynasty? Henry VIII, Elizabeth I. Names that would create England's golden age. Write in the comments, but what if Richard had lived? What kind of country would England have been? Richard's body was buried at Greyfriars Monastery in Leicester. But the monastery was destroyed by Henry VIII in 1538. The location of the grave was lost. For centuries, people thought Richard's bones had been thrown into the river. But the truth was completely different. The bones were hidden under the monastery, beneath an abandoned parking lot. The 2012 discovery, solving a 500-year mystery. In 2012, archaeologists from the University of Leicester started a crazy project. They would search for Richard III under a parking lot. Most people had laughed at this. But the archaeologists had studied 500-year-old maps and located the monastery's position. On the first dig, they found a skeleton. But could this be Richard? The physical characteristics matched: scoliosis, battle wounds, age. But the definitive proof was the DNA test. It was compared with the DNA of Richard's great-great-granddaughter's descendant. Result: 99.99% match. Write in the comments, did this discovery surprise you? What other mysteries in history should be solved? The wounds on Richard's skull bring his final moments before our eyes. He fell from his horse, fought with swords, was finally brought down. But he fought as a king until his last breath. In 2015, Richard III was reburied at Leicester Cathedral. Representatives of Queen Elizabeth II attended the ceremony. After 530 years, Richard had finally found the respect he deserved. Who was the real Richard? Complex truth. Shakespeare's Richard was a hunchbacked monster. But the truth is much more complex. Did Richard really kill the princes? There's no definitive proof. In 1674, 2 children's skeletons were found in the Tower of London. Could these be the princes? DNA testing wasn't done because Westminster Abbey doesn't allow it. Write in the comments, do you want these tests to be done? Should some truths remain hidden? Richard also had some positive aspects. He had made justice reforms in northern England, tried to protect the rights of the people. Maybe he wasn't entirely evil. But power changed him. Or maybe power brought out the dark side that was already there. History's lessons. Richard III's story isn't just the death story of a king. This is the story of how power changes people, how betrayal shapes history. Richard, who died at the Battle of Bosworth, was England's last true warrior king. All kings who came after him would be politicians. So how did Richard's death affect England? The Tudor dynasty laid the foundations that would make England a world empire. Renaissance, discoveries, colonies. It all started with Richard's death. Write in the comments, was Richard's death good or bad for England? Those two deep wounds on the skull symbolize not just the death of a king, but the closing of an era. Medieval England died there, on Bosworth Field. And remember, history is only the story written by the winners. So what is the real story? Maybe we'll never fully know. And a video engagement call, what do you think about this story? Was Richard guilty, or was he a victim? Let's discuss in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe because next week I'll tell you another historical mystery. What topic would you like us to cover? Make suggestions.